Good afternoon. I am Gregory Washington, the president of George Mason University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Russia's war on Ukraine in a historical perspective. Our Russian and Eurasian Studies program developed this 12-part series as part of a course Mason faculty are teaching on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The goal of this series is to present the work of 12 scholars and writers from around the world. Their insights help us to understand the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine, the invasion itself, and the remarkable resistance of the Ukrainian people. Through the perspective of these historians, we are better able to comprehend the war in Ukraine in a broader context. This series is an illustration of how humanities research in a public research university can create knowledge, spur discussion, and expand understanding of complex global issues. We appreciate your viewership of this series, and we are proud that George Mason University can bring it to you. Enjoy.
Well, thank you to President Washington once again. I play this video every week. I want to emphasize how important it is to hear a university president talk about the importance of humanities research in a public research university and how that makes things like this series possible. I'm Professor Steve Barnes of George Mason University. My TA is off today, by the way. She got married over the weekend. Congratulations to Jessica. And I want to welcome you to the 9th in our ongoing series. We enter now the last third of our events, but we have many great ones still left to come. Welcome to my class. Welcome to this series. It's made possible through the support of the program in Russian and Eurasian Studies, the Department of History and Art History, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, all parts here of our George Mason University community. The war drags on as we move toward a winter in which Russia seems intent on spreading suffering to as many civilians as possible across Ukraine, while it holds out hopes that democracy will prove weaker than authoritarianism, and that tomorrow's election in the United States brings to power a party that might want to withdraw American support for Ukraine. I ask you all not only to vote, but also to put whomever is elected on notice that we must continue to support Ukraine in its fight for freedom. In addition, with winter coming, it is more important than ever that we continue to support Ukraine. And I'll ask again that you consider making donations to Razum for Ukraine, which works indefatigably on the ground in Ukraine to provide humanitarian relief and recovery assistance. Additionally, I'll remind you to join conversations with me and Professor Cynthia Hooper of the College of the Holy Cross on Fridays at 3 p.m. Eastern, where she and I and the audience and sometimes special guests engage with an effort to continue the conversation and to understand the war. Finally, check out my Twitter feed where I share the readings and films assigned in my class, and you're welcome to share your reactions to our weekly speakers and the things that inspire you as you think about this war with the hashtag RWOU for Russia's war on Ukraine. Today, I'm excited to welcome Professor Francine Hirsch, the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I knew from the moment that I planned this series that I would invite Professor Hirsch to be part because she modeled very early in March how one can use their historical research to help us better understand the war. She recently published a book, Soviet Judgment and Nuremberg, a new history of the International Military Tribunal after World War II, revealing the unexpected contribution of Stalin's Soviet Union and the International Military Tribunal and to the post-war development of international law. She's also a towering figure in the historiography of the questions of ethnic difference and the making of the Soviet Union, work that I still have my own graduate students reading this very semester and that you can see here over my left shoulder. Please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A feature on Zoom, And I'll ask as many as I'm able after Professor Hirsch finishes with her thoughts. And with that, Fran, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm really very happy to be here today and speaking with you. Thanks so much to Professor Barnes for that really generous introduction. As you all know, I'm a historian of the Soviet Union. And since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February, I've been speaking and writing a lot about the present. I believe it's essential for historians to push back against Putin's manipulation of history and memory. I also think it's critical for us to use our knowledge of the past to help inform discussions about the present moment and the future. Back in 2020, when I published a book about the role of the Soviet Union in the Nuremberg trials, I never imagined that it would have present-day relevance. And I never anticipated that I'd be giving public lectures about Russia's war crimes and atrocities in Ukraine. But here we are. I've been hoping for a Ukrainian victory and some kind of a new Nuremberg moment. And I'm not alone here, of course. International lawyers and politicians have vowed that the criminal actions of Russia's leaders and soldiers will not go unpunished. International institutions, such as the International Criminal Court, along with dozens of national governments and international organizations, have mobilized to investigate Russian war crimes and crimes against humanity. They've been gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses, and this work that they've been doing is hugely important. Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office has also launched its own effort to prosecute Russian soldiers for war crimes. It held its first trial in May, and more trials of Russian soldiers have followed. At the same time, though, some international lawyers and world leaders, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, have argued that these current efforts do not and really cannot go far enough. They've been calling for the creation of a special international tribunal, possibly on the Nuremberg model, to try Russia's leaders for the foundational crime of planning and waging an illegal war of aggression, what at Nuremberg was called a crime against peace. My work as a historian on the role of the Soviets at Nuremberg has come into play in, for me, was a very surprising way here. It was cited by a group of lawyers last March in their draft indictment to try Putin for aggression, to help to make the case. And that indictment was published on the website Just Security and then in the Washington Post. Today, I'd like to talk with you about the history of war crimes and about Nuremberg and suggest why that history is so relevant to the present moment. I agree with those international lawyers and world leaders who argue that Russia's leaders must be held accountable for waging a war of aggression. I also believe that it's critical to talk about this now, even when a Ukrainian victory might look far off or even uncertain. And there are several reasons for this, which I'll come back around to at the end. But for now, I want to tell you what's been driving me. When politicians say that it's time to negotiate with Putin, when opinion columnists for the New York Times call on Ukraine to make concessions, it's clear to me that they don't understand this war. They don't understand what's happening in Ukraine. They don't understand Putin's intentions. Putin has launched a predatory war of aggression with genocidal intentions. And this should be, must be, shaping our conversations. I've organized my talk today around three key questions, and I'll kind of tell you what they are and then walk you through them. First of all, what is the crime of aggression? Here, I'll do a bit of a deep dive into the history of war crimes and Nuremberg, and then I'll come back up and discuss why that history absolutely matters today. My second question, why is there talk today of convening a special international tribunal when we have the International Criminal Court, the ICC? To answer this, I'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of the ICC and its limitations, and I'll walk you through some of the current options for justice. My third question, why talk about this now when the war is far from over? And here I'll reflect on some lessons from Nuremberg and on the importance of planning now for the future that we want to see. Okay, so to begin, what is the crime of aggression, or what at Nuremberg was called a crime against peace? To really talk about this, we have to actually go back to the 1920s, when international lawyers and politicians were vigorously debating the legality of war, when they were desperate to preserve the peace after the devastation of World War I. In 1927, the League of Nations adopted a resolution deeming a war of aggression to be an international crime. The next year, in 1928, the United States, France, and 12 other countries signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, renouncing war as an instrument of national policy. By late 1929, some more than 60 states had signed on. Now, the League of Nations resolution and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, they were seen at the time as significant achievements, and they were, right? But some international lawyers criticized them for not going far enough, for failing to make aggressive war a punishable criminal offense. One of those lawyers was the Soviet Union's Aaron Trainin. In publications and lectures in the 1930s, including in 2 books, Trainin called for the creation of an international criminal court to try persons, including leaders, who violated the peace. Now, as we all know, this discussion went nowhere and did nothing to prevent the Second World War. But the horrors of that war and the horrors of the Nazi occupation of Europe brought a renewed discussion about the illegality of war, a conversation in which Trainin would play a major role. Okay, so World War II. The Soviet Union took up the question of Nazi criminality during the darkest days of the war, when victory seemed very far away and uncertain. In April 1942, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov published his 3rd note on German atrocities, citing evidence that the burning of villages and the massacre of civilians were part of a deliberate German plan put together by Germany's leaders. 6 months later, in October, Molotov publicly called for the convening of a special international tribunal. He invited all governments, all interested governments, to cooperate, to come together in bringing Hitler and other Nazi leaders to justice. The Soviets were out in front here with their demands for justice and accountability. The United States and Britain were not interested at that time in talking about a trial of Nazi leaders. They were worried about reprisals against Allied prisoners of war, and honestly, they couldn't see the point of having such a conversation in the middle of the war. And so the Soviets went down their own path. They turned down an invitation from the British to join an Allied War Crimes Commission, convinced that it was not prepared to go far enough. They created their own War Crimes Commission, the Extraordinary State Commission, and Molotov asked Soviet lawyers to assess the criminal responsibility of Nazi leaders, to assess the criminal responsibility of Nazi leaders for invading other countries in pursuit of predatory goals, and for the atrocities that were committed as part of that invasion. Now, it's not going to surprise you when I tell you that one of those lawyers was Trainin. In the summer of 1943, Trainin presented a report to Molotov called The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites. Trainin argued that the scope of the war was so overwhelming and Nazi crimes against civilians so shocking that it would be unthinkable, and I'm quoting him here, unthinkable not to hold the perpetrators to account. He maintained that the German state must face political and economic sanctions. But he also argued that criminal responsibility must be borne by individual perpetrators. Trainin argued that soldiers must face punishment for their crimes. He rejected the plea of superior orders, which was a popular defense at the time. But he argued also that the greatest degree of criminal responsibility belonged to Germany's leaders. And here he called out Hitler, Hitler's ministers, the leadership of the Nazi Party, Nazi authorities in the occupied territories, the military high command, and Germany's industrial magnates. Trainin further argued that Germany's leaders should be tried not only for traditional war crimes, for violations of the laws and customs of war, but also for waging the war. for committing crimes against peace. Trienen coined the term crimes against peace. He had a long definition, but it included a number of key things, including acts of aggression, propaganda of aggression, the conclusion of international agreements with aggressive aims, in other words, intent to commit aggression, and terrorism. Trienen repeated Molotov's call for a special international tribunal. He also proposed that crimes against peace be included in a new international law convention. A few months later, in October 1943, that Allied War Crimes Commission that the British were setting up, it met in London, right? And it was called the United Nations War Crimes Commission, the UNWCC. And the Soviet Union was the only Allied power not at the table. The UNWCC members, immediately became embroiled in a debate about how to define war crimes. The commission's head, the British judge, Sir Cecil Hurst, wanted to define war crimes as violations of the laws and customs of war. But representatives from occupied Europe fought for a broader definition. The Belgian representative, Marcel de Beer, and the Czech representative, Bohuslav Etcher, argued that the commission must extend its reach to acts that would not typically be considered war crimes, including Germany's persecution and murder of its Jewish population. They also urged the UNWCC to expand its definition of war crimes to include the crime of war. They argued, and I'm quoting them here, that without aggressive war, there would be no war crimes, and that it was illogical to punish the products of the crime and not the crime itself. Soviet leaders and lawyers, of course, shared this view. In July 1944, Soviet leaders turned Trienen's report into a book. The timing here was critical. The Red Army was on the move. That summer, it launched its most ambitious offensive, retaking Belarus and marching westward. The Soviets again pressed their case before an international audience for convening a special international tribunal. Trienen's book soon made its way across Europe to London, where it was translated into English and discussed by the UNWCC. And some UNWCC members, like Etcher, embraced it. At a meeting in October 1944, Etcher argued that defining the current war as criminal, and I'm quoting him here, made it possible to see acts like the extermination of foreign races, not as simple violations of the laws and customs of war, but as instruments of a general criminal policy. Channeling Trienen, he urged that the preparation and launching of the present war be punished as a crime against peace. From London, Trienen's book traveled to the United States. It landed at the War Department's Special Projects Branch and then at the White House. In January 1945, a couple of lawyers from the Special Projects Branch, Murray Bernays and D.W. Brown, they wrote a secret report for President Roosevelt, asking the question and answering it of whether starting the current war was a crime for which Nazi leaders could be tried and punished. They answered yes, even as they acknowledged that this opinion broke from current US policy. They argued that international law evolves with the public conscience. I'm quoting them here again, and that it could no longer be disputed that the launching of a war of aggression today is condemned by the vast majority of mankind as a crime. They also pointed out in their memo that this view was shared by a number of Allied lawyers, including the British lawyer Hirsch Lauterpacht and the Soviet lawyer Trienen. As the Allied victory seemed certain, American and British leaders came to embrace the idea of bringing Nazi leaders before a special international tribunal. After the Nazi surrender in May 1945, plans to organize the International Military Tribunal, what were soon called the Nuremberg trials, began in earnest. Representatives from the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, including Trienen, met in London that summer to discuss the tribunal's framework. And much of the discussion centered on the charges. It was agreed that the defendants would be charged with traditional war crimes, violations of the rules and customs of war, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. Crimes against peace turned out to be the central charge at Nuremberg, the crux of the entire case. The judgment declared aggressive war to be the supreme international crime, containing within it the accumulated evil of the whole. The judgment dismissed the defense's argument that Germany had been pushed into war by the terms of the Versailles Settlement after World War I. The judgment described Hitler's ultimate aim of an aggressive war as the creation of a greater Germany. And honestly, it's impossible to read the judgment today and not to think about Putin's rants about NATO and Putin's talk about the Russian world. The Nuremberg trials revolutionized international law. It recognized the new crimes of crimes against humanity, genocide, and crimes against peace. It established that the leaders of a state could be held criminally responsible for waging a war of aggression, that leaders did not have immunity from prosecution. Nuremberg served as a precedent for future post-war trials and as a launching point for further discussions about human rights. This was a moment of great optimism about the progressive development of international law. This was the time that historians call the Nuremberg moment. Soon after the trials in December 1946, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution affirming the principles recognized in the Nuremberg Charter and judgment. The United Nations also discussed the creation of a permanent international criminal court. The effort to create that international criminal court stalled during the Cold War, in part because of concerns about state sovereignty, and one sticking point was actually the definition of aggression. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United Nations revisited the idea of an international criminal court with ultimate success. In 1998, 120 states adopted the Rome Statute, creating the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and in 2002, the ICC began meeting in The Hague. Okay, so there's the history, and why does it matter, right? So the Cold War has shaped how we remember Nuremberg and the post-war moment. And it's easy to forget that the Soviet Union helped to lead a revolution in international law. And I think that remembering this, though, is absolutely crucial. I think that it matters that Putin has breached an international legal system that the Soviet Union, that Russia, that Moscow-based lawyers helped to create. The Soviets insisted on trying Germany's leaders for some of the very same crimes that Russia's leaders are committing today. Putin has launched a war of aggression. The Russian military has been bombing hospitals and schools and apartment buildings in many of the same Ukrainian towns and cities that German forces targeted during World War II. Russian soldiers have raped, tortured, and murdered peaceful civilians. They've kidnapped and deported Ukrainian children. They've set out to destroy Ukrainian culture. In short, they've committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. They violated the Nuremberg principles. And if a special international tribunal is convened to try Russia's leaders for waging a war of aggression, the world will have the Soviet lawyer Trainin partly to thank. All right, I'm going to move on now to the second question. Okay. Why is there talk today of convening a special international tribunal to try Russia's leaders for the crime of aggression? Why would we even need such a tribunal when we have the International Criminal Court, the ICC? And when the ICC has already thrown itself into the fray, putting money and resources into preparing war crimes trials? To answer this, we need to talk a bit about the ICC's jurisdiction, about what the ICC can and cannot do. All right, so bear with me. It's a little technical, but I tried to break it down for you. So the ICC has the power to investigate crimes committed on the territory of ICC member states, crimes committed by the nationals of ICC member states, and crimes referred to it by the United Nations Security Council. This third point is critical. because Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and dozens of other states, some 70 in all, have not joined the ICC. In theory, the United Nations Security Council could refer a case against Russia to the ICC, but we all know that this will never happen because Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council and has a veto. And I think that we can all agree that this is a ridiculous situation. And I could give a whole talk just about this, but I'll move on. That said, the ICC can investigate some crimes committed in Ukraine. In 2014, Ukraine invited the ICC to investigate war crimes committed on its territory. As a result, the ICC can investigate war crimes committed in Ukraine by all parties to the conflict. And this is indeed, as you've been watching the news and following things, this is what the ICC currently is doing. But there's a critical crime that the ICC cannot investigate in Ukraine, the crime of aggression. And to explain this, I have to get into some of the details of why this is the case and what happened with the Rome Statute. So in 1998, the Rome Statute gave the ICC the authority to investigate war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. The Rome Statute did include aggression as a fourth possible category, but no one could agree on a definition. At least that's what was happening on the face of it. But of course, the reality behind the scenes is that many states were concerned about sovereignty, were concerned about their leaders being put on trial. So the inability to come up with a definition was a big excuse. And so the ICC's power to investigate aggression was put on hold. In 2010, an agreement on the definition of aggression was finally reached. An addendum to the Rome Statute, the Kampala Amendments, defined the crime of aggression as the planning, preparation, initiation, or execution of an act of aggression, which by its character, gravity, and scale constitutes a manifest violation of the UN Charter. It then defined an act of aggression as the use of armed force by one state to attack the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state with or without a declaration of war. And a number of examples were actually given, which included things like invasion, bombardment, occupation, and annexation. The Kampala Amendments further defined aggression as a leadership crime. Now, as you're listening to this, I thought, okay, we check off all the boxes here, right? Putin's actions against Ukraine would clearly fit the bill. But still, the ICC lacks power here. A number of compromises were made to get the Kampala Amendments through, and the ICC's jurisdiction over aggression was significantly limited. All ICC member states can opt out of ICC jurisdiction for aggression crimes, and most have done so. Plus, the leaders and citizens of non-ICC states like Russia are fully exempt from prosecution for aggression. This means that the ICC cannot investigate Putin and other Russian leaders for aggression against Ukraine. And this is why there's been talk of creating a Nuremberg-like special tribunal to come in where the ICC lacks jurisdiction. Over the past few months, a number of models have been put forward for such a tribunal. One possibility is a special international tribunal, that's what it's called, established by a treaty among interested states. Another option is a special Ukrainian court to prosecute aggression that would be operating in close collaboration with other European states, and that would include Ukrainian and other European judges. Still, another proposal that was actually made just a few weeks ago was for a special tribunal in which the European Union takes the lead. All of these models borrow to a greater or lesser extent from the Nuremberg Charter and from Nuremberg's framework. Now, establishing a special international tribunal to try aggression would obviously take a great deal of effort. And a number of international lawyers have challenged the efficacy or usefulness of making such a move. After all, there are mechanisms in place to prosecute Russian soldiers and officers for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And the ICC and Ukrainian courts are doing absolutely tremendous work. Some lawyers insist that this should be enough for justice to be done. But I actually disagree. I agree with those lawyers who insist that we must try aggression. Aggression is the foundational crime for reasons that Treinen, Etcher, and others well understood during the Second World War. Holding Russian leaders and officers accountable for aggression makes it possible to see the murders, deportations, rapes, disappearances, and other horrific crimes being carried out by Russian forces in Ukraine, not as simple violations of the laws and customs of war, and I'm quoting Ecker again here to kind of bring him back in, but as instruments of a general criminal policy. It makes it possible to see these atrocities not as isolated incidents, but as part of an all-out assault on Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. The war of aggression, which was planned and waged by Russia's leaders, has made possible all the other crimes that have followed. Okay, and this is going to bring me to my third question. And by the way, I'll be happy to talk in more detail about any of these things during the Q&A as well. Okay, so my third question. Why have this conversation now? Right, and people often ask me this, why are we talking about war crimes? Like what's the, not war crimes, but tribunals and post-war justice, what's the point? Shouldn't we just be focused on Ukraine winning the war and we can talk about this later? And I think we all understand that Ukraine will have to win the war or that something will need to change dramatically in Russia before Putin can be tried for aggression. Although in theory, just to throw this out there, Putin could be tried in absentia. There was room for that in the Nuremberg framework and charter. Martin Bormann was tried in absentia at Nuremberg, but I don't know, I'm not sure what that would accomplish right now. But regardless, the history of the Nuremberg trials suggests why it is absolutely critical to plan for post-war justice in the middle of the war, even if the outcome of that war seems uncertain. The Soviets created momentum for a special international tribunal during the darkest days of World War II, during the German occupation. They shaped the international conversation about individual criminal responsibility and justice. They shaped the conversation about war crimes and about the crime of aggression. Their extraordinary state commission interviewed eyewitnesses and gathered evidence as soon as territories were liberated, putting together a compelling record of the Nazi occupation and of what we now know as the Holocaust. Without these Soviet efforts, Nuremberg may very well not have happened. The Soviet effort to organize a special international tribunal during the Second World War also helped the Soviets to wage that war. It helped to spread information about German atrocities in the occupied East, and it helped to counter Hitler's propaganda. It helped to shape the public's understanding of Hitler's war of aggression. And a concentrated effort to plan for post-war justice now, I think, can similarly help Ukraine by systematically laying bare Putin's lies about his special military operation, and by reminding politicians and New York Times columnists that Putin's predatory war of aggression is aimed at the destruction of Ukraine. Now, Nuremberg, of course, had its flaws too, and we should not shy away from talking about them. If plans indeed go forward to convene a special tribunal to try aggression, I hope that international lawyers and world leaders have a close look at the International Military Tribunal, at what it got right and in the areas where it struggled, in order to see what can be improved upon. And for me, a couple of things come immediately to mind. First of all, there must be clear rules from early on about the collection, registration, preservation, and use of documentary and forensic evidence. And I think we need to have this conversation now, and that a centralized clearinghouse must be established to avoid issues later, right? And this is something that they grappled with at the time of the trials, and we all know what happened with Katyn. And so I think, again, this is something people should get on top of right at the start. Second of all, external bodies should be involved in prosecuting the cases to avoid or quell concerns about victors' justice and to preserve the tribunal's legitimacy. Nuremberg has been dogged by the criticism that as a court of the victors, it had no hope ever of being impartial. In the wake of the trials, the French judge on the International Military Tribunal, Henri Danjou-Davab, he revealed that he had been deeply troubled, even while at Nuremberg, by such allegations of victor's justice, and that the judges had felt the need to constantly, counter that as they were going along. Davab became a vocal advocate afterwards at the United Nations for the creation of a permanent international criminal court. And one of the reasons for this was to eliminate the need in the future, right, for ad hoc tribunals. We now have an international criminal court, the ICC, but as we've seen, its power is significantly restricted. I want to conclude by bringing us back to that 1945 memorandum that the two War Department lawyers, Bernays and Brown, sent to President Roosevelt, where they wrote that international law evolves with the public conscience. Where are we today with international law? What is the public conscience? Like, where is it? For war crimes to be punished, for our international legal system to work, states must be willing to get behind international principles, to join international institutions, and to pursue enforcement. States, even large and powerful ones, must be willing to cede some degree of sovereignty. If we don't want to have ad hoc trials and ad hoc tribunals, rather, in the future, we will need a permanent international criminal court with a much broader mandate. We'll need a rethinking of our international institutions, like the United Nations Security Council, and maybe even a new conversation about the progressive development of international law. We'll need, dare I say, a new Nuremberg moment. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to having a broader conversation.
Fran, that was outstanding. So many things to think about. We already have a lot of questions that have come in. I would encourage everybody to continue to submit the questions that you have. I want to return for a moment at the start to what you were talking about, fears of victor's justice, and return to Nuremberg itself. Linda Droker asked, she says, shouldn't Molotov himself have been tried for war crimes, since the pact he signed with Ribbentrop paved the way for the invasion of Poland by Germany and the Soviet Union, and the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Soviet Union of the Baltic states? And I asked this question that she's put forward here, just a little bit to think through, like, even in that Nuremberg moment, were there, well, you talked a little bit about the concerns that there were, but if you could talk just a little bit more about the concerns around issues of victor's justice, and sort of how they played in Nuremberg, and what concerns you might see in that respect today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a huge theme in my book as well, in terms of, again, trying to understand this, because the Soviets might have come up with this concept of crimes against peace, but they too committed crimes against peace with the invasion. It's not just the signing of the secret protocols, right? But then it's the actual invasion of Poland and the invasion of Finland and the Baltic states. And I mean, the thing about Nuremberg was that it was, right, a tribunal that was organized and held by the victors. It was understood as such. And yet there was an idea that among the judges that they would still be able to be impartial. The Soviets, their idea of what Nuremberg would be, it was different actually from how it turned out. They thought that it wouldn't just be a tribunal of the victors, but that it would look a lot more like what we would think of as show trials, where the defendants wouldn't be allowed to testify at all, where they wouldn't even have attorneys. And that, of course, was not the case. The Western powers and the Western judges in particular insisted that the defendants would have their day at court. The prosecutors tried to work very hard to keep the trial focused on European Axis crimes, and that was in fact how the trial was organized. But as things progressed, the tribunal created a record in which there is indeed, a record of some Allied crimes as well. But it's a big question, right? And I think that the ideal case would be an international criminal court that is not one of the countries, that it's a more neutral body. So.
Mm-hmm. So Anastasia Makovit in my class here asks if you could talk about the Nuremberg trials and what they meant for the individual survivors of Nazi war crimes with respect to the trauma that they experienced. And in particular, she's interested here in how international criminal law can serve justice in a way that provides relief for the generation of Ukraine today that is most impacted by this war of aggression.
Right. And so one of the reasons that the Soviets were so interested in organizing Nuremberg trials was for catharsis, right? Was for the idea that it would bring some relief for the victims to be able to testify, for people to have a narrative, to understand, right, what had happened. But one of the big debates after Nuremberg was whether Nuremberg actually really did that, whether a trial could really ever bring true justice. And what true justice actually looks like, right? And I don't know that I have an answer to that, but what I do think that was critical, the most, for me, the most important moments of the trial were the witness testimony, when Soviet and French witnesses testified about what they had experienced in all kinds of situations. And I think that for some people that did bring a sense of acknowledgement of the suffering that had happened and perhaps some relief, but it's so impossible to know.
Yeah. One of the things that my students and I have definitely been talking about this semester is, how can Russia change? And obviously one of the examples that we always have in mind is Germany, and how Germany so dramatically changes after World War II. And there's a lot of belief, I think, that the Nuremberg trials were a big part of that. And so Kieran Barr in my class asked, after having read a couple of the articles that you've written, Fran, he says, talking about how Russia and Putin have themselves been using the Nuremberg trials inside their own, inside his own country, right, to justify the war in certain ways. And he's asking if many Russians continue to believe that Russia's participation in the war is justified, sort of what happens if they lose this war? What actions in concert with a Nuremberg-like trial could be taken to combat the lasting effects of Putin's propaganda? Like, how do we see a Nuremberg-like moment lead to the kind of change that we would like to see in Russia, or like what happens in Germany after World War II?
No, these are all such good questions, and right. I mean, this is obviously something that I've been thinking a lot about too, in terms of, again, how there are memory laws in Russia right now, and that's one of the things that I've written about, where it's illegal to talk about Russia's war crimes, and it's during World War II, presently as well, but during World War II, and where it's illegal to talk about Russia's crimes against peace, or to talk about the secret pact between Russia and Germany and what that involved. And so, I mean, it's something where there's never been a full reckoning in Russia today with the Stalinist past and the crimes of the Stalinist era. So this continued refusal to reckon with what happened, and Russia's not the only country that has memory laws, and Russia's not the only country where history plays that kind of a very politicized role, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that one of the to me, again, the question about justice and whether people really got justice out of Nuremberg, that's a tricky question. It's hard to know because individual people experience things in different ways. But I think in terms of the historical record that was produced, the evidence of what had happened, that I think was very significant, and significant for Germany, right, as well. And so one would hope, I think one of the goals, and that's why I think even at some point, whether Putin, Hitler wasn't tried in the Nuremberg trials, right? He was dead by then, and still they were hugely significant, right? So whether Putin is tried or not, the opportunity to have a moment of real reckoning where people have a chance to testify in court and to tell their stories, and where all of that evidence is brought to bear, and where Russians can hopefully participate in that process of understanding what had happened, I think that would be hugely, hugely important and significant. But I worry, of course, and this is one of the things that I wrote about in that Time magazine article, about these efforts to stage these show trials in Russia now, to, all these accusations of Ukrainians as Nazis and all of this, and to tell that narrative, because that propaganda effort it's very widespread in Russia right now. And that whole new political education that's been introduced for school children, and I don't know. I don't know. It's really disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an overwhelming sort of thought. The whole field, of course, of transitional justice clearly comes into play here, and thinking far beyond just trials. Even I know that it's really important, and what you're talking about is really important. But I think it does sort of indicate that this needs to be part of a sort of multi-pronged strategy. Yeah. So I'm getting lots of questions and comments, as you might imagine, along the lines of this one. Let me read this from Dr. Stephen Hall, who's assistant professor in Russian politics at the University of Bath. He says, what is the actual likelihood that the Russian government will face war crimes? Putin and the elite aren't going to travel anywhere. They can be indicted. Russia isn't going to be defeated to the extent it either gives these people up or Western forces are in Moscow. Yes, Putin may lose power, but even then, I doubt a new regime would indict him. So I'm getting lots and lots of questions and comments basically saying, doesn't seem likely that this could ever even happen. So, I guess in some sense, what's the point then?
Right, that's the question number 3, right? Like, what is the point? So you didn't find my answer satisfactory, did you? So I mean, again, I think part of the point is that the effort to make the case, even if it's not tried in court right away, I think that collective effort to gather the information, to centralize that movement to gather information, to articulate a case, even if it is just right now in the public domain, to me, that's worth doing. And I don't know, I mean, no one knows what the future will hold, like whether there will be actual trials. It's impossible to predict right now. I mean, I know it looks grim, but right, it's impossible to predict what the future of Russia is, right? And that's a big part of the question.
So let me ask another question from one of my students. Austin Marcus wrote, asking what type of retaliation you expect to see from the international community toward Russians and their war crimes if the war were to end today. He says, would you expect any type of international punishment to come down on regular Russian soldiers or just on high-level commanders? And he has in particular questions about, sort of how you see at the moment this sort of just following orders defense that is made sometimes, to participation in war crimes, kind of at the ground level of those who are actually carrying out the violence day to day.
Well, the ICC is starting to put together some cases against soldiers, and Ukraine has been trying soldiers as well. And so they've argued that the superior orders defense, right, does not hold water. I think it's going to depend case by case what it looks like. For those of you who have been following, when in the initial war crimes trials carried out by the Ukrainian courts, the original sentence was very harsh, right? And then it was softened and mitigated because of the idea that, again, if you're going to punish the rank and file soldiers for this, but you're not going to be able to bring the generals to justice, that there was a sense of unfairness there. So, I don't know what it will ultimately end up looking like. I really don't. So many people, and there's so many different possibilities that are out there, and so many discussions that are going on simultaneously about what justice looks like. I think it'll be tried in these courts, right? And then it'll depend in part, like, who's the prosecutor, who's the judge, what's the defense argument.
Stan Schroeder asks if creating a special tribunal on aggressive war just plays into Putin's or possibly also China's paranoia that the West is sort of just against them, that this is just a matter of politics and not justice. I'm wondering sort of your impression of of the role that this would play in terms of how it would be used by Russian propaganda within Russia today, this kind of
I don't
thing?
think we need to do anything for the Russian propaganda machine to work, right? I mean, Russian propaganda is often based on all kinds of lies and rumors and everything else. And so I don't think that should be what holds us back from making a move. I mean, I think the politics of this are obviously incredibly complicated. And that's one of the things that we've been seeing in the United Nations, that you would think the United Nations would be able to act, that it would even, I mean, there are ways for it to make a side run around the Security Council, right? That happened in the case of the Korean War. But it's not clear that because there's a way in which in certain countries blame the United States or take Russia's side or economically dependent on Russia. So it's not always clear where all those votes are going to line up. So it is a very complex moment politically, but I don't think that we should let the complexity of that moment stop us from acting.
Is there a way in which Ukraine would be able to carry out trials on its own, on for crimes that have taken place on its own territory? Is there something that can happen beyond the level of an international tribunal here?
So Ukraine is carrying out trials for war crimes, right, and crimes against humanity, and it's also been talking about carrying out aggression trials for kind of mid-level people. But in terms of Putin himself and other leaders, international lawyers who I've been speaking with say that it can't because of immunity. So the Nuremberg leaders were not immune, but according to other kinds of international law, Ukraine would not be allowed to do that. Ukraine would have to work with another state. Now, there are proposals on the table for a special tribunal that is, led by Ukraine, and in which again the European Union is involved. And the most recent proposal, coming out of Ukraine for some kind of a special tribunal for aggression, actually the discussion is that Ukraine would do it itself and carry out the prosecutions. And Kevin Heller and some other international lawyers have been writing about this as being, dangerous. Again, for some of the reasons of victor's justice, right? If Ukraine carries out these trials, then will they be seen as indeed legitimate? And other lawyers argue that according to international law, they can't even try. I mean, and again, let me come back to the point that this is still really theoretical, that we're having this really heated argument about like who can try Putin. And really, maybe the focus needs to be on the formulating the charges and the collection of evidence. And maybe we need to revisit like who carries out that trial later on. Yeah, I'm not sure.
What do we know about how and whether Ukraine is active in ensuring that its own soldiers are following the rules of war in this case? Do we have any evidence about that?
Well, there's Ukraine. I believe that Ukrainian courts have been looking into allegations of Ukrainian war crimes as well. And Ukrainian courts they would have to do that again to have. I mean, that absolutely has to be the case.
Yeah. Eva Novak asks, he said, will U.S. participation in or enthusiasm for a special tribunal be contingent on a statute of limitations or other limits to prevent a diversionary tactic by Russia to argue hypocrisy because there was no tribunal for the U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan? So she's talking here about the fear of trials of U.S. officials being why we didn't sign on to the international court agreements in the first place.
Right. So the U.S. is trying to play this very carefully in terms of its relationship to the ICC. The United States is not about to join the ICC anytime soon. And so that's, again, part of why there's talk of the aggression crime being something that would have to be separate, right? A different tribunal with its own set of rules that would not think about like what happened in the past, but just stay focused on the current moment.
Sorry, just looking through, we have tons of questions coming in, Fran.
I wish I had a lawyer here with me to answer some of the
yeah,
law
seriously,
questions.
yeah. So can the spread of mass information or disinformation, such as Putin's notion of such as Putin's notion of Ukraine being a fake state, and that it is somehow actually Russian, can this be considered a war crime or become a triable offense?
So that's a really interesting question in terms of propaganda. And so again, at Nuremberg, it was inciting people to violence. And that's the kind of propaganda that could be tried in court. So inciting people to violence, inciting people to genocide. General propaganda, that was not something that was seen as punishable.
Mark Tauger, one of our colleagues, makes a comment that I think is actually interesting, and I'll just read it out. He says, another reason for doing this now, he said, people recorded the atrocities of the Stalin period, but they could only be addressed after his death. There was a de-Stalinization then. Someday, you know, God willing, there's a de-Putinization, and at that point, an international tribunal or something like this, you know, could certainly help to have documented all of this.
I agree.
So Shmuel Metz asks about war crimes that higher command doesn't order, but that it also doesn't do anything to prevent, that it doesn't seem to really care about. Can you tell us a little bit about that, sort of how that might play?
So, so again, so in terms of just to make sure I understand this, so the role, so what is the role of the military high command? Is it just the incitement to crime and direction to crime, or is it failing to prevent crimes that it knows about that are taking place, right? And
exactly.
Failing to prevent, knowing that crimes are taking place and failing to prevent it, that is the generals are considered criminally responsible for those acts. They were at Nuremberg. I mean, again, part of what's so complicated about studying this is that there are all of these different bodies of international law, and lawyers themselves will kind of argue the finer points of some of these things. But in the case of Nuremberg, and I believe, but I don't quote me on this, I know I'm being recorded, but I believe that also under the ICC that would be the case as well, but I'd have to look it up.
So can we talk about another issue here a little bit? So you talked about the Nuremberg trials, right? And that it was war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. You also talked about this Nuremberg moment, and we see here, of course, the creation of the International Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. And I was wondering on that last subject in particular of genocide, could you talk a little bit about sort of your understanding of this war? You described it, I think at the beginning, as an aggressive war with genocidal aims. I was wondering if you could just talk about whether you believe that the crime of genocide is applicable in the case of this war, and what relationship that would have then to international prosecution.
Yeah, no, this is one of those really tricky questions in the sense that the understanding of genocide in international law now is narrower than the understanding of genocide was at the time of the Second World War, as it was sort of being developed. And so during the Nuremberg trials, I'll just give a little history of this because I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, please do.
So at Nuremberg, as a result of the efforts of Raphael Lemkin and the British prosecution and some others, genocide was introduced into the indictment, not as a separate category of crime, but it was listed as a war crime, right? We now think of genocide as more connected to crimes against humanity. Then it was a war crime. And so there were not separate charges of genocide. Right, it was just kind of part of the list. Then in the course of the trial, in the prosecution's speeches, genocide began to be discussed as not just, well, it was the extermination of people, right? But it was also starving people to death. And it was also wiping out a group's culture. And so that question of culture, right, in particular, is something that's still been debated. And today, that's not something that's that there's a big debate among international lawyers about cultural genocide, right? So in terms of what's happening right now, I think that and the other thing with genocide is that you have to prove intent, and that's part of why that's tricky, right? Because in order to prove intent, the lawyers are, well, what kind of evidence does one need to show the intent as opposed to the actions themselves? And so when there's been, again, these discussions among Philippe Sands and other international lawyers about what crimes to try, a lot of them will say, like, stay away from genocide because it's almost impossibly difficult to prove in court because of intent. At the same time, Many international lawyers who are watching the situation will tell you that it's clear to them that genocide is taking place, right? It's just one of those things where the burden of proof is so high that that it's very, very difficult. I personally, from based on what I've been reading about and what I understand about the effort to destroy Ukrainian culture, the effort just so many of these things. There's just the denial of Ukraine as a nation, right? I believe that that fits the definition of genocide and that we should be talking about this as a genocide. I don't know what would happen, you know, should they try to prove that in court, though.
Yeah, it's interesting. Once the genocide convention, if it's invoked, right, it actually entails some duty to prevent on the part of those states that are signatories. If I remember, it's been a bit since I've read. I mean, I know this gets really complicated, but I also seem to recall that sort of, you know, during the genocide in Rwanda, reluctance to use the term genocide precisely because to use that term would then require additional international involvement that many countries didn't want to provide at that point. I don't know. It's interesting. The U.S. has been reluctant to use the word, but there have been Eastern European countries that have specifically invoked it and voted on it in their parliament. And things like this. So
you know, Blinken and Biden, I mean, U.S. leaders have been using the term. I mean, kind of like in speeches, they've been discussing about a genocide. Okay. So again, it's again, in terms of the commitment to following up and the commitment to getting involved. It's been right. I don't know what it would take, and I don't know what the right policy move is either, right? In terms of what it would look like to get further involved. These are such complicated questions, obviously.
Yeah. So with this crime of aggression, and here I'm drawing on a question from Jeffrey Kramer, in terms of proving the elements of a war of aggression. What specific ways does the way in which the war is being conducted play a role here, right? So let me just read his question. Would specific elements of the way the war is being conducted be used to support the prosecution of a case of this war being a war of aggression? That is, destruction of electrical grid infrastructure, launching missiles at civilian apartment buildings, these kinds of things. So what are the sort of interconnections, I guess, of you know, war crimes, just sort of traditionally understood, and this crime of aggression as you're talking about?
Right. No, to prove a crime of aggression, well, I'll just talk about how it was done at Nuremberg, right? Because that's the easiest example, way to do it for me. So to prove the crime of aggression at Nuremberg, it was proven by documents, right, in that case. So, and the Nazi regime, that there were many documents with their war plans and their plans for an invasion and the plans for what they would do after they invaded and what that would look like, right? The orders to the generals, the battle plans, it also conversations, discussions of like interviews with witnesses of what they were told the war was about and how they should be acting. Again, at Nuremberg, the talk about the generals being told that, you know, it was they should not obey international law, that the goal was to take over the territory. So that was the kind of evidence that was used at the Nuremberg trials to prove the aggressive war charge. And so, right. So again, it's interesting to think about a special international tribunal now. I hadn't fully, it's a great question, right? How would they go about collecting the kinds of evidence? Would it be, a lot of that would be interviews with commanders, with people who were conducting the war themselves. And so that would also not happen right away.
So another question, I think, you know, sort of thinking into the future, you know, how likely is it that the lifting of sanctions, this comes from Paul Abushan, how likely is it that the lifting of sanctions could be contingent on a post-Putin government complying with war crime investigations and tribunals?
No, that's interesting, right? Yeah, that would be a really interesting scenario. It's funny for a historian kind of thinking into the future about these different scenarios like this. But yeah, one could imagine, hopefully, right, that kind of a scenario of a post-Putin government that wants to cooperate and rejoin the international community, and that agrees to even a set of limited prosecutions, right, for the lifting of economic and political sanctions.
Mark Togger again, he asks, how would you respond to critics like Chomsky who minimize Russian atrocities by comparing them to the large number of civilians the U.S. killed in Iraq and Vietnam and so forth, for which there were no counterparts to the Nuremberg trials?
Yeah, I mean, this is, first of all, I hate the whole whataboutism thing, right? Because I don't know what you do ever, right? There's no blank slate and there's no going back. And if we take that kind of a position, then we just sit on our hands and just say, well, things happened before, and so therefore just like let it all rip. So that really, really frustrates me. At the same time, this is part of that call for, maybe I didn't make it strongly enough, but I think we really need to rethink these issues of state sovereignty and really need to think seriously about our international institutions, and that if the United States wants to have a leadership role, that it has to think about the ICC or some other kinds of institutions and be willing to join them and to try to lead from within. I don't know if that will ever happen because of the politics, right? And what that would ultimately look like. And but as far as Chomsky goes, I just think it's ridiculous. I mean, that's, yeah.
So I have a student who asks, just in terms of, and here I think maybe to think about how Nuremberg happened, but also sort of what possibilities are here. She writes, if enough of the sort of middlemen, the soldiers, their immediate commanders, these kinds of people are prosecutable, is there a sort of process where you do the equivalent of basically giving them a deal in exchange for their testimony against their superiors? Could they inform on those higher up in the military to get evidence? Is there that kind of capacity within this system, the way that there would be within a criminal justice system domestically?
Oh, that's a super interesting question. And it's like kind of a lot to chew on there. So thinking about, again, how things happened at Nuremberg, some of the things that were accepted as evidence was testimony from other national war crimes trials that were taking place, including Soviet war crimes trials. And so that was in part how they helped to build the case, with evidence that had been presented and verdicts that had been reached. And that was in part how they also kind of came up with the list of defendants. But it's a different question about whether that's a good idea, right? In part because then you have evidence come in that case of Nuremberg, then you had evidence coming from different kinds of court systems and evidence coming from some trials that I don't think that we would see as the kind of trials we would necessarily want to take evidence from, right? Like the Kharkov trial, for example. So I think, again, so much care is going to have to be taken right now in terms of how evidence is collected, how those national trials take place, really with an eye to not just justice in the moment, but with an eye to making sure that if some larger trial, and we don't know, right, but if there's an opportunity in the future for some larger trial, that evidence is being collected, interviews are being done, national trials are happening in a way that, again, it's systematic, it's clear what's happening, we can trust the evidence, so that all of that could be used later, right? I mean, in Ukraine, remember, one of the prosecutor generals was fired because it was thought that she wasn't going about that in a way that would ensure legitimacy, and that was pretty controversial at the time. But if your aim is ultimately some kind of justice, Ukraine has to be so clean about how it does this, right? Everything has to be on the up and up so that there can be no questions later, and so that evidence could be used.
Have you thought about at all sort of the how things look different? I mean, I'm thinking, differences between World War II and now, and one of them, of course, is social media. It's everybody having a camera in their pocket. It's I think ultimately not going to be about too little evidence, but about how to deal with too much. Have you sort of thought through this issue at all, and how it might look different in this case in the age of sort of information overload?
I have, and I've had some really interesting conversations with international lawyers about this, and with some people who were involved in some of the collection of evidence. It's incredibly different. We have more evidence now than anyone knows what to do with. Evidence of things happening in real time, right? I mean, whether it's, video evidence, phone conversations, GPS, the ability to pin, and again, this is part of why we need to be talking about it now and figuring out what kind of evidence would be accepted, right? How will that evidence be put together? How will its veracity be proven? These are exactly the kinds of conversations that we have to have in this moment in order to figure out how to prosecute cases later. So yeah, I mean, and I know this is something that some people are thinking about and actively working on too, but I think it's urgent, actually.
So let me ask you one last question, Fran. Obviously, you've focused a lot on Nuremberg, in part because it's your particular area of specialty. Stephen von Christierson says, the focus has been on the Nuremberg experience. Have there been more recent atrocities in Serbia, Syria, Ethiopia, et cetera, within the past 30 years that might actually be more useful in trying to understand the current situation?
So right. So the tribunal that was put together for Rwanda and the tribunal that was put together for Yugoslavia, right? Those have helped to inform how the ICC, right, looks at things and deal with things. And so again, the idea was that now that we have the ICC, we would not need a special tribunal like the tribunal for Rwanda or the tribunal for Yugoslavia. But I do think that if in fact a special tribunal is put together to try aggression, that obviously we shouldn't just be looking at Nuremberg, that we should be looking at a whole range of efforts in the past to reach post-war justice. And I think that looking at the models of the trials for Rwanda and Yugoslavia would also be incredibly helpful.
Fran, thank you so much. This was just incredibly rich and useful. I want to just take a minute to invite everybody to join us again next week. I'm going to put a couple of things in the chat for you here. First off, we have joining us next Monday, Olesya Kromechuk, who is the director of the Ukrainian Institute in London, whose work and whose lecture at the British Slavic Studies Association conference back in the spring, I talked about in my first lecture in this series, were so influential on me in terms of thinking about where Ukraine sits in my own mental map. She has an absolutely fantastic book, and I'm going to talk to her about it. It has just come out in a new edition in the UK, unfortunately not distributed in the United States at the moment. It's The Death of a Soldier Told by His Sister. I've put an Amazon UK link into the chat because my students were able to order it that way. I was able to order it that way and get it delivered to the United States. So I urge you to take an opportunity, if you can, to take a look at that book and to read that book. It's really interesting. It's going to be a really terrific conversation. We're going to do this a little bit different next week. She's going to talk just a bit about the book and do a short reading from it. And then we're going to mostly have a conversation between she and me. And so in the coming week, if you have questions that you would like to ask her, please feel free to email them to me, to tag me on Twitter, and of course, to bring your questions with you when you come in next time. Another reminder that on Fridays at 3 p.m. Eastern, we're having these conversations. We're working on a guest for this week, hopefully to help us once again to focus on the impact that the war has had on particular world regions beyond just Ukraine and Russia itself. So thank you everybody so much for coming. It's been so great to see so many people turn out week after week. Thank you to Professor Fran Hirsch for this fantastic presentation. And I'll hope to see everybody back a week from today. Take care.